I just want to hear it run one more time. That was all Raymond Cruz asked for. One last sound, one final roar from a machine that had carried him through 30 years of road brotherhood and war. He was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arm and a clock ticking somewhere no one could see, and his only wish wasn't a person. It was a bike, a 1977 Hells Angels shovelhead. 49 years old, silent for 15. If this story hits you somewhere deep, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the end. Drop your city into the comments. I want to see how far this ride has traveled. Marcus Webb had seen a lot of things roll through the doors of Iron and Grit Custom Repair. Basket cases, fire damage, flood bikes pulled from rivers. A 1969 panhead so stripped down, it was basically a pile of philosophy held together by rust and wishful thinking. He had never turned a job away. Not once in 19 years. He almost turned this one away. The trailer backed up to the shop door on a Tuesday morning in late October. Damp air, smell of rain coming. Marcus was on his third cup of coffee arguing with Joey about a carburetor float setting on a customer's Sportster when the knock came. Not a customer knock, the slow, deliberate kind that meant somebody needed something they weren't sure they had the right to ask for. He opened the door and found a woman standing in the lot, mid-50s, tired around the eyes the way people get when they haven't been sleeping because they've been sitting in hospital chairs. She had a jacket pulled tight around her, despite it not being that cold, and she was holding a folded piece of paper like it was the most important document in the world. "Are you Marcus Webb?" she asked. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Carla Cruz. My husband is Raymond Cruz. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "He's at St. Michael's, cardiac. They don't know yet if he's going to another stop. He asked me to bring his bike here. He said you were the only shop he trusted." Marcus looked past her at the trailer. He couldn't see the bike yet, just the shape of something under a canvas tarp. Old shape, low, long, the kind of silhouette that doesn't belong to anything built after 1985. "I don't know your husband," Marcus said carefully. "He knows you. He said he watched you rebuild a 74 Ironhead 3 years ago. He said if anybody could do this, it was you." She held out the piece of paper. "He wrote down what he wants." Marcus took it, unfolded it. Raymond Cruz's handwriting was shaky but deliberate, the handwriting of a man who understood this might be the last clear thing he ever put down on paper. "I just want to hear it run one more time. That's all. One more time." Below that, a single line of description. 1977 FLH shovelhead. Last started 15 years ago. All original. Do not modify. Marcus folded the paper back up. He looked at the trailer again. "Let me see it," he said. They pulled the tarp off together, Carla and Marcus, and the bike underneath stopped him cold. It was not what he expected. He had expected bad. He had not expected this. The 1977 shovelhead sat on the trailer like something excavated from a tomb. Every surface that could rust had rusted. The chrome was gone, not peeling, not pitting, just gone, replaced by a uniform brown-black crust that had eaten through to bare metal in places. The leather seat had cracked and curled so badly it looked like dried bark. The engine cases were caked in 15 years of garage grime layered over whatever road grime had been on the bike when it was parked. Both tires were flat, not just low flat, and cracked through to the cords. The handlebars had a slight lean that suggested something structural had shifted. And there was something else. Something Marcus noticed that he didn't say out loud yet. There was a fracture line running along the lower frame rail just above the primary cover. Hairline. But there. Joey drifted over from the Sportster without being asked. He was 26 sharp with anything built after fuel injection became standard, and he had the habit of reaching for his diagnostic tablet the way older mechanics reach for a wrench. He looked at the shovel head for a long moment. "There's no port for a scanner," he said. "I know. This thing predates everything I know how to read." "I know that too." "Marcus," Joey lowered his voice, "that frame rail, I see it." Terrence came out of the back bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag, took one look at the bike, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Terrence was 44, had been doing old-school mechanical work for 20 years, and was not easily impressed or easily discouraged. He crouched down beside the engine without being asked and looked at the primary side, the rocker boxes, the carb, The oil lines. He stood up. The carburetor looks seized, he said. I can tell from here. Yeah, Marcus said. And the oil pump, I'm not even going to guess what's going on in there without pulling it. No, Terrence looked at Marcus. What's the job? Marcus handed him Raymond's note. Terrence read it again, handed it back. One more time, he said quietly. That's all he wants. That's all. Carla Cruz was standing a few feet away, watching the three of them look at her husband's life's work in various states of professional doubt, and she didn't say a word. She understood what the silence meant. She had probably been living inside that same silence for weeks. We'll try, Marcus told her. I can't promise you more than that, but we'll try. She nodded once very quickly, like she was afraid if she moved too much, something would break. He said to tell you. She stopped, cleared her throat. He said to tell you that bike has 200,000 miles on it, that he rode it from California to New York and back in 1987, that it never left him stranded. Not once, she paused. He said it deserves better than dying in a garage. Marcus looked at the bike. Yeah, he said, it does. The first day was about assessment, just looking, measuring, cataloging the damage without touching anything that didn't need to be touched. Marcus had a system: you never start pulling things apart until you understand what you're dealing with, because the worst thing you can do to a sick machine is start operating before you have a diagnosis. Joey circled the bike 3 times with a flashlight and a notepad, writing things down with the focused energy of someone who had never actually been defeated by a mechanical problem, but was beginning to understand that today might be different. No diagnostic port, he muttered again. No ECU, no sensors. There's literally nothing for me to read electronically. How did people even work on these things? They listened, Terrence said from the other side of the bike, where he was using a dental pick to probe around the base of the carburetor. They looked. They thought. I listen. I look. Not the same way. Terrence didn't say it meanly. He said it the way you say something true that doesn't need elaboration. This carburetor is a Linkert. Haven't seen one of these in service in, God, maybe 12 years. And it's not just seized, it's flicked. Whatever fuel was in here when this bike got parked turned to varnish and then turned to something harder than varnish. He tried to move the throttle slide with a gloved finger. It didn't move a millimeter. This alone is 2 days of work. What about the oil pump? Marcus asked. Can't tell yet. Need to get the primary cover off. But look at the drain plug, he pointed. Marcus looked. The drain plug had a visible crack running through it, not from the threads, from the middle of the hex. That crack is old, probably got over-tightened years ago and nobody noticed, which means every time this bike got an oil change, whoever was doing it was tightening against a compromised fitting. Which means the threads in the case might be stripped, Marcus finished. Or worse, might have been seeping for years before it got parked. Might have been running low on oil for longer than anyone knew. Joey looked up from his notepad. If it was running low on oil, then the internal wear is going to be worse than we can see from outside, Terrence said. Yeah, the three of them stood there for a moment with that realization settling over the shop like weather. I'm going to pull the primary cover this afternoon, Terrence said. We'll know more then. He knew more by 4 o'clock, and none of it was good. The oil pump was not just worn, it was destroyed. The drive gear had shed teeth. Not one tooth, not two, a section of the gear face had simply disintegrated, probably from years of low oil operation, before the bike ever got parked, and the resulting metal debris had circulated through the engine in whatever oil remained, scoring every surface it touched. Terrence laid the pieces out on a clean shop rag and photographed them with his phone, not for documentation, but because he needed a minute to process what he was looking at. This pump didn't just fail, he told Marcus. It failed catastrophically. And the bike kept running. Whoever was riding this thing, Raymond, he was either not paying attention or he was paying attention and riding it anyway. Or he didn't know, Marcus said. You don't know when a shovel head is hurting. You feel it. You hear it. It changes. Maybe he didn't want to stop. Terrence considered that for a moment. Thought about a man who had ridden 200,000 miles on one machine, who had crossed the country twice, who had been part of something that didn't allow for softness, and maybe that same hardness had kept him from listening when the machine tried to tell him it was dying. He pushed it too hard for too long, Terrence said finally, and then one day it just gave out, and he parked it, and 15 years went by. Can you rebuild the pump? Terrence looked at the debris on the shop rag. I can try, but Marcus, the parts for this pump aren't on any shelf anymore. We're going to have to source them. And sourcing 1977 shovelhead oil pump components. I'll start calling, Marcus said. Joey appeared in the doorway of the back bay. He had grease on his hands now, which was notable because Joey almost never got grease on his hands. He was the kind of mechanic who used gloves for everything. But he had been elbow deep in something, and the look on his face confirmed it wasn't anything simple. I pulled the rocker boxes, he said, and 2 of the rocker arm bolts are broken off inside the head. He held up his phone, a photo of the rocker box interior, 2 bolt shafts snapped flush with the casting. They didn't break recently. There's corrosion on the brake face. These have been broken for a long time, which means the rocker arms were running loose. Which means valve timing was off, Marcus said, potentially for years. Yeah. The shop went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of focused work, but the particular silence of people recalculating. Every new piece of information was not a problem to solve. It was evidence of a deeper problem already established. The bike had not simply sat dormant for 15 years. It had been damaged before it was parked. The parking had just preserved the damage in amber. Marcus went to his office and sat down and looked at Raymond Cruz's note for the second time that day. I just want to hear it run one more time. He thought about calling Carla, decided against it not yet, not until he knew more. She was already carrying enough. By the end of day 2, the shop had a running list of confirmed problems that filled an entire legal pad page. Seized carburetor, destroyed oil pump with metal debris contamination, 2 broken rocker arm bolts, worn internal gears on the cam side that Terrence had determined were at the edge of operational tolerance, which in a bike that had already proven it could run past the edge of tolerance meant they were probably beyond it. A cracked primary chain tensioner, and the frame rail. Always the frame rail sitting there in the corner of every conversation like a debt nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. On the morning of day 3, Terrence gathered everyone in the front bay and laid it all out flat. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said. I've rebuilt shovels before. Not many, they're a dying breed, and most of the people who knew them died with them. But I've done it, and I want to be straight with all of you. He paused. I don't know if I can do this one. Joey started to say something. Let me finish, Terrence said. The carburetor I can work through. The broken bolts I can drill and tap. It'll take time, but I can do it. The cam gears I can source and replace. The oil pump, he stopped. The oil pump is the problem. The drive gear is proprietary to this year's pump. It's not interchangeable with later models, and the original parts are either unavailable or the ones that come up for sale are from donor bikes that are in the same shape as this one. So we fabricate, Marcus said. I can't fabricate this. I don't have a lathe. I don't have the metallurgical specs. This isn't welding a bracket. This is precision machining on a component that runs under load at high RPM. If I get it wrong and we blow the engine the first time it starts, and then Raymond Cruz gets the news that his last wish destroyed his bike. Nobody said anything to that. I'm not quitting, Terrence said. I want to be clear. I'm telling you we need help. Specifically, we need someone who has done this before, not someone who has rebuilt shovel heads generally, someone who has fabricated parts for this specific generation of motor. Marcus knew what Terrence was suggesting before he said the name. He had been turning it over in his own mind since day 1, the way you circle something you're not sure you want to disturb. Walter Boyd, Terrence said. Joey looked between them. Who's Walter Boyd? Neither of them answered right away, because Walter Boyd wasn't a simple answer. Walter Boyd was a complicated answer. Walter Boyd was the kind of answer you only reached for when you had run out of simpler ones. He's retired, Marcus said finally. He's 68, Terrence said. He uses a cane now. His hands still work. Marcus stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot for a long moment. The shovel head was in the west bay, partially disassembled, its engine exposed in a way that felt almost indecent, like reading someone's letters without permission. He thought about Raymond Cruz in a hospital bed 200,000 miles from the last good ride. He thought about the note, the handwriting, the simplicity of the ask. He pulled out his phone. I'll call him, he said, but I'm not making any promises about what he says. Chai. Walter Boyd answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly what Marcus remembered, unhurried, deliberate. the voice of a man who had spent decades listening to things other people couldn't hear and had learned that rushing never improved the signal. "Marcus Webb," Walter said. "It's been a while." "It has. Walter, I need a favor." "You need more than a favor. You only call me when you need more than a favor." A pause, not uncomfortable, just Walter being Walter. "What is it?" Marcus described the bike, the year, the condition, the oil pump, the broken bolts, the frame concern. He read Walter the list from the legal pad, all of it, without softening anything. Walter didn't interrupt. He listened the way he always listened, completely. When Marcus finished, there was silence on the line for a full 10 seconds. 1977 FLH, Walter said. "Shovelhead." "That's right. Original motor. All original." Another pause. "What's the story on the owner?" Marcus told him about Raymond, the hospital, the note, the 200,000 miles, the one last time. Walter was quiet for a moment longer this time. When he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but more present, like a door had opened that he hadn't planned on opening. "I'll come look at it," he said. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll come look. That's all I'm asking." "No, it isn't," Walter said, "but I'll come anyway." He arrived the next morning, Thursday. No announcement, no phone call ahead of time. Just a truck pulling into the lot at 7:15 before Joey had even finished making the first pot of coffee. Marcus heard the truck and went to the door and watched Walter Boyd climb down from the cab. 68 years old. He moved carefully. The cane was real. A wooden one, no adjustable aluminum nonsense, but he moved with a quality that wasn't slowness exactly. It was economy. Every motion had a purpose. He didn't waste steps. He wore a canvas work jacket that was older than some of the bikes Marcus had worked on, and he carried a battered metal toolbox that he had probably owned for 40 years. He walked into the shop without being invited. That was Walter. He didn't wait to be welcomed into spaces he intended to work in. He went straight to the back bay, straight to the shovelhead. He stood in front of it for a full 2 minutes without touching it or speaking, just looking. His eyes moved over the machine, the way a doctor's eyes move over a patient, not looking for what's wrong, but building a complete picture before committing to any diagnosis. Then he set down his toolbox, picked up a flashlight from the workbench, and crouched beside the engine. He shone the light into the oil pump cavity. He looked at the broken bolt stumps in the rocker box. He looked at the cam side. He ran one finger along the crankcase seam and looked at the residue that came off on his fingertip. He stood up. "This engine isn't dead," Walter Boyd said. His voice was quiet and completely certain. "It's been ignored too long. That's different." Joey was standing in the doorway with his coffee mug. "What's the difference?" Walter looked at him. Not unkindly, the way a teacher looks at a student who has asked a real question. "A dead engine is one that's been destroyed past the point of recovery. A neglected engine is one that gave up because nobody was listening." He turned back to the shovelhead. "This motor tried to tell somebody it was in trouble for a long time before it stopped. Now it's been sitting in silence for 15 years. That silence isn't death, it's waiting." Terrence was leaning against the workbench, arms crossed. "The oil pump drive gear is gone. And the parts—" "I know," Walter said. "We can't source them." "I know that too." He opened his toolbox and took out a set of calipers. Old ones, machinist's calipers, the kind you didn't see anymore. "I'm going to need measurements. And I'm going to need to borrow your lathe if you have one." "We don't have a lathe," Marcus said. Walter didn't look surprised. "There's a machine shop on Grover Street. Carl Messing. Tell him I sent you. He'll let you use his." "Walter," Marcus waited until the old man looked at him. "Can you actually do this?" Walter Boyd considered the question with the gravity it deserved. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the bike again. Looked at the broken pieces Terrence had laid out on the shop rag. Looked at the frame rail without anyone having told him about it. He just saw it the way he saw everything, because looking completely was the only way he had ever worked. "That frame crack," Walter said. "You see it. I see it. That's going to be the hard part." "I know. Everything else." Walter picked up the destroyed oil pump gear and turned it in his fingers. His hands were steady. Not young man steady, something different. Steady the way old things were steady, not from strength, but from having learned to stop fighting gravity. "Everything else I've fixed worse, with less." He set the gear down. "I need coffee," he said. "And then I need everyone to stop telling me what can't be done and start handing me tools when I ask for them." Joey looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Terrence. Terrence unfolded his arms. For the first time in 3 days, nobody in Iron and Grit Custom Repair was thinking about giving up. They were thinking about what came next. And what came next was harder than any of them fully understood yet. But for the first time since Carla Cruz had stood in the parking lot holding her husband's handwritten note, the air in that shop felt like something other than defeat. It felt almost dangerously like possibility. Walter Boyd didn't waste a single minute of that first morning. He drank half a cup of coffee, set it down on the workbench without finishing it, and went straight back to the shovelhead, like the coffee had only been a formality, something he did to be polite, not because he needed it. He started with the carburetor, not because it was the most critical problem. He knew it wasn't. But a carburetor was a conversation starter. It told you things about how the machine had been treated, how the rider had operated it, what kind of relationship existed between the man and the motorcycle before everything went quiet. Walter had learned this years ago. You don't begin with the hardest problem. You begin with the one that talks the most. He set the Linkert on a clean section of workbench and began disassembling it with a patience that made Joey visibly uncomfortable. Joey was built for speed, diagnosis, solution, execution. He moved through mechanical problems the way young people move through everything, like delay was failure. Watching Walter work was physically difficult for him. Every movement the old man made was deliberate and slow, and the deliberateness wasn't hesitation. It was precision. Walter never moved his hands without knowing exactly where they were going. "How long is this going to take?" Joey asked. He was trying not to sound impatient. He failed. "As long as it takes," Walter said. "That's not an answer." "Sure it is." Walter didn't look up. He was using a wooden-handled pick to probe the interior of the carburetor body, reading what he found with his fingertip the way a blind man reads text. "You want a time estimate or you want it done right? Can it be both?" "Not today." Joey looked at Marcus. Marcus shook his head slightly, the universal signal for let it go, and Joey retreated to the Sportster he'd been neglecting for 3 days, though he kept glancing back every few minutes like he couldn't help himself. Terrence pulled a stool up beside Walter and watched without speaking. That was the difference between Joey and Terrence. Terrence understood that watching Walter work was not wasted time. It was education, and education on this particular subject was not available anywhere else. The varnish inside the carburetor was worse than Terrence had estimated. It had polymerized, essentially turned into a hard plastic-like coating over every internal passage, every jet, every needle seat. Not something you could dissolve with standard carb cleaner and a parts washer. Walter went to his toolbox and produced a small bottle of something that had no label on it, just a piece of masking tape with handwriting, too faded to read. "What is that?" Terrence asked. "Something I mix myself. 40 years ago, I found out that commercial carb cleaner wasn't strong enough for varnish this far gone. Spent about 2 years working out the right ratio." He submerged the carburetor components in a small tray and poured the solution over them. "They'll soak for 2 hours. Don't touch them." "What's in it?" Walter looked at him sideways. "You want the recipe or do you want to watch how I use it?" Terrence smiled despite himself. "Both eventually." "Eventually by your..." Walter agreed, and there was something in the way he said it, not dismissive, but measured, like he was already thinking past this moment to the ones that would follow. Like he understood that teaching was a long process, and he was prepared to be patient with it. He moved to the engine while the carburetor soaked. The broken rocker arm bolts were next. 2 of them sheared flush with the aluminum head, the kind of problem that looked straightforward until you were actually in it and then revealed itself to be a trap. Drill too fast, you generate heat. Generate heat in aluminum, the metal moves, the drill walks you. Ruin the threading boss. Ruin the threading boss on a 1977 head that you cannot replace, and the story ends there. Not with a roar, with silence. Walter set up the drill press extension with a steadiness that was almost ceremonial. He marked both bolt centers with a scribe, checked the alignment twice, then a 3rd time. "You're going to drill it freehand," Joey called from across the shop. He had given up pretending he wasn't watching. "Not freehand, by feel." Walter looked at him. "There's a difference." "That sounds like freehand." "When you've drilled enough extraction bores, your hands learn the line. It's not something I can explain. You either have the hours or you don't." He paused. "You'll have them someday. Maybe." Joey was quiet, not offended, something else. He was listening in a way he didn't usually listen, with a kind of humility that didn't come naturally to people who had never encountered a problem they couldn't solve with a diagnostic tablet. Walter began the first extraction. Slow speed, steady pressure. The drill bit moved into the broken bolt material with a sound that Marcus recognized from decades of shop work, that specific controlled shriek of metal on metal being managed rather than forced. The whole shop got quiet when that sound started. Even the Sportster seemed to hold its breath. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The broken bolt stub released with a sound like a small exhale, and Walter set the drill down and picked up the bolt fragment with needle-nose pliers and laid it on the bench. One, he said. Terrence let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The second bolt took 4 minutes. Walter stopped twice, once to recheck his angle, once because he felt something in the resistance that he didn't like, a slight variation that told him the drill was beginning to deflect. He pulled back, assessed, adjusted, and went back in. Nobody spoke while he did this. Nobody offered advice or asked questions. They just watched a 68-year-old man with a cane do something they could not have done with 10 more years of experience apiece. When the second fragment came out, Joey put his coffee mug down on the workbench with a definitive thunk and walked over to look. How, he said. It wasn't a full question. It was all he had. Time, Walter said simply. Not years of reading about it. Years of doing it. Years of getting it wrong and then doing it again until your hands remembered what right felt like. He set down the pliers. You can't download that. You can't scan for it. It's in here. He held up his right hand, steady as a level. 40 years of wrong turns until the turns started being right. Joey stared at the 2 bolt fragments on the bench for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, like something had shifted in his internal architecture. Okay, he said. Okay, Walter agreed, and went back to work. The carburetor came out of the soak at the 2-hour mark, and Walter inspected every passage with a jeweler's loupe he produced from his breast pocket. He found 3 that were still partially blocked jets packed with varnish residue that the soak had softened but not fully cleared. He used a single strand of copper wire, nothing else, to clear them. Not a drill, not compressed air. A single strand of copper wire moved with the same economy of motion that characterized everything he did. Why copper? Terrence asked. Softer than the brass jet body, can't damage the orifice diameter. Walter held the jet up to the light and looked through it. The orifice diameter is everything on a Linkert. Get it wrong by a 0.5 and your air-fuel mixture is off. Get your mixture off and you're fighting the engine every mile you ride. He handed the jet to Terrence. Look through it. Terrence held it to the light. The bore was clean, perfect circle, not scratched, not widened. Copper wire, Terrence said. Copper wire. Walter took it back. Old trick, probably older than both of us. Marcus had been on the phone most of the morning, working through a list of parts suppliers that got shorter and less promising with every call. He came back into the back bay at noon with a look on his face that Terrence read immediately. The cam gears, Marcus said. What about them? I found one supplier with the right part number, 1. He's in Arizona. He's got 2 sets. He wants $400 for 1 set. Walter looked up from the carburetor reassembly. They worth it? At this point, yes. Then buy them. I already did. Marcus paused. Walter, the oil pump drive gear. I've called 17 suppliers. Nobody has it. Nobody can cross-reference it to a later part. It's a 1977 only spec, and I know, Walter said. I told you, we're going to make it. On Carl Messing's lathe, I need you to get me a measurement from the original gear first, whatever's left of it. And I need the pitch spec if Terrence still has his factory's service manual. For this generation, the oil pump section will have it. Terrence went to the office and came back 3 minutes later with a battered Harley-Davidson service manual. Pages soft with use, spine repaired with electrical tape. He found the section, laid it open on the workbench, and Walter looked at it without picking it up. Page 414, Walter said. Drive gear specification. Terrence looked. Page 414. Drive gear specification. How did you know? I wrote service manuals for this generation. Not this one specifically, but I know where everything lives. Walter looked at the spec. took out a small notepad and wrote the numbers down in a handwriting that was cramped and precise. This is doable. It's going to take most of tomorrow, and Carl's going to complain about the tolerances I need, but it's doable. You're going to machine the gear yourself, Marcus asked. Who else is going to do it? Nobody answered that, because the answer was obvious. Nobody else. Nobody else in the building, possibly nobody else in the city, had the combination of knowledge and willingness that Walter Boyd carried around in his 70-years-old body, like a piece of infrastructure everybody had forgotten they were depending on. The afternoon brought the next blow. Terrence had been cleaning the engine cases, not disassembly, just careful external cleaning, to get a better look at the overall condition of the castings when he found it. Not the frame crack, which everyone already knew about. Something else. Something inside. He called Marcus over without speaking. Just a look. Marcus came. He was pointing at the lower engine case just above the flywheel cavity. There was a crack in the casting. Not hairline visible. It ran approximately 2 inches along the case seam in a direction that indicated it had been there for a long time, possibly sealed internally by the accumulated oil sludge that had hardened into something resembling gasket material over the years of disuse. If they cleaned the case completely, the crack would open. If the crack opened under pressure when the engine started, the case would fail. Oil pressure would be lost instantly. The engine would seize within seconds. And Raymond Cruz's last wish would become the sound of his life's work destroying itself. Marcus stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then he went and got Walter. Walter looked at it for longer than he had looked at anything else. He ran his thumbnail along the crack line and felt the depth of it, the direction of propagation, what it told him about the stress history of the case. How, Marcus said. Impact probably. Years ago, something hit the lower case hard enough to initiate a crack. Could have been a road strike. Could have been a dropped engine during a rebuild. The sludge has been bridging it, acting as a seal, which is the only reason this engine held oil pressure as long as it did. Walter straightened up. Terrence, you ever done aluminum TIG welding on an engine case? Terrence hesitated. I've done aluminum TIG, not on a case under load specs. But you've done it. Basic work. Brackets. Sheet metal. Good, that's a foundation. Walter looked at the crack. This needs to be preheated, welded, and stress relieved. If it's done wrong, the weld will be harder than the surrounding material, and it'll crack again at the heat-affected zone. If it's done right, he touched the case gently. If it's done right, this becomes the strongest point on the entire case. And if it's done wrong, Joey asked from behind them, then we've destroyed an irreplaceable engine case and we go home. The silence that followed was the longest of the week. Longer than the silence when the oil pump debris came out. Longer than the silence when the rocker bolt sheared. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when you realize the difficulty has just changed categories, when what you thought was a mechanical problem reveals itself to be a precision problem, the kind where the margin between success and failure is measured not in degrees of effort, but in degrees of skill that either exist in a person or don't. Terrence was thinking about it. You could see him thinking, not planning, but measuring himself against the requirement, being honest about the distance between what he knew how to do and what this needed. I don't know if I can do it, he said. What is a defeat? As a fact. I know, Walter said. That's why I'm going to teach you before you do it, and I'm going to be right next to you when you do. You can teach me TIG welding on an engine case in how much time do we have? 4 days, Marcus said quietly. She called this morning. Raymond's condition it's not good. The doctors are talking about a procedure. Carla asked if we had any update. What did you tell her? I told her we were making progress. Walter looked at him. That's true. Is it enough? Walter picked up his cane and walked back to the workbench, where the carburetor pieces were laid out in their precise order ready for reassembly. He looked at the parts for a moment, then looked at the 3 men who were watching him with the particular desperation of people who need a specific kind of hope, not the vague general kind, but the kind that has a name and a plan attached. It's enough to keep working, Walter said. That's the only answer that matters right now. The bike isn't done failing yet, and we're not done finding the failures. But every problem we find is a problem we can solve. He began the carburetor reassembly with hands that didn't shake. The ones we don't find are the ones that kill you. He was right about that in a way none of them understood until the next morning. They had been focusing on the mechanical failures, the pump, the bolts, the cam gears, the carburetor, the case crack. Working through the list systematically, prioritizing, assigning, making progress in the incremental way that hard mechanical work demanded. There was a rhythm developing. Walter at the center of it, patient and precise. Terrence absorbing everything, asking the right questions, his 20 years of general experience beginning to orient itself around the specific demands of this specific machine. Joey evolving in real time, slower now, less reliant on his tablet, more reliant on his hands and his eyes, and the part of his brain that had been underused because the diagnostic port was always there. Then Marcus got the phone call, not from Carla, from Raymond. He had apparently improved enough overnight, briefly, temporarily, in the way very sick people sometimes rally without warning to use a phone. His voice, when Marcus answered, was thin and effortful, the kind of voice that came from lungs that weren't working at full capacity, but it was there. It was real. "Marcus Webb," Raymond Cruz said, "I hear you took my bike." "I did." Marcus walked out of the back bay for privacy, but not far. "How are you feeling, Raymond?" "Like a man who's been attached to machines for 2 weeks. A pause, something that might have been a laugh, might have been a cough. "How's she look?" Marcus considered his options. He could soften it, could frame it carefully the way you frame bad news for someone who doesn't have reserves left to absorb it. Or he could treat Raymond Cruz like what he was, a man who had ridden 200,000 miles and knew exactly what a machine that had been ridden that hard would look like after 15 years of silence. "She looks like everything you put her through finally came due at once," Marcus said. "She's in bad shape, Raymond. I'm not going to lie to you." A long pause. "But you're working on her." "We've got Walter Boyd here." The pause this time was different. "Walter Boyd," Raymond said. "I didn't know he was still. He's still. Damn." A sound that was definitely something close to a laugh. "Walter Boyd. I haven't heard that name, and he did the top-end rebuild on a 74 Shovelhead I had back in '89. Down in Riverside. Best work I ever saw. He hasn't lost it." "No, I didn't figure he would." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, I need you to be straight with me. Is she going to run?" Marcus looked back through the bay door at the Shovelhead, partially disassembled, its engine case cracked, and being assessed by a 68-year-old man with a cane and 40 years of muscle memory. He looked at the destroyed oil pump components on the shop rag. He looked at Walter's notepad with the drive gear specifications written in precise, cramped handwriting. "We're going to give her every chance we can," Marcus said. "Walter thinks it's possible. That's as honest as I can be right now." Another pause. Longer. "That's enough," Raymond said finally. "That's more than I expected." His voice had gotten thinner in the last 30 seconds, the rally fading, the effort catching up. "Tell Walter, tell him they said thank you. Tell him I know what it costs to come back for one more." Marcus didn't know exactly what that meant, but he said he would tell him. When he went back inside and delivered the message, Walter stood very still for a moment with his back to the room. When he turned around, his face was composed of the particular composure of a person who has decided something privately and is not going to explain the decision. "Then we'd better not waste it," Walter said, and picked up his tools, and went back to work on a machine that was refusing to die, surrounded by men who were refusing to let it. Walter didn't sleep at the shop. He went home every night, drove his truck back to wherever he lived. None of them had asked, and he hadn't offered, and returned every morning before anyone else arrived. Marcus would pull into the lot at 6:30, and Walter's truck would already be there. Every single day. No explanation, no commentary about it, just there the way a fact is just there. On the fourth morning, Marcus came in and found Walter standing at the workbench with his coffee, looking at the drive gear specifications he had written in his notepad. Not reading them, he had those numbers memorized. Just looking at them the way you look at something you've already decided about, verifying the decision one final time before you commit. "Carl Messing said yes," Walter said without turning around. "We're going to his shop this morning. I need Terrence with me. For the gear. For the gear and for something else." He set the coffee down. "Terrence needs to see how this is done, not just this gear, the whole process. How you think about a part before you cut it. How you measure not just what the spec says, but what the machine is going to do to that part under load. How you build intolerance for a motor that's been stressed the way this one has been stressed. He finally turned around. You can spare him for the morning. I can spare him as long as you need him. Walter nodded. Good, because what I'm going to show him this morning, he's going to use for the rest of his career, whether he knows it or not. Terrence heard that from the doorway where he had appeared with his own coffee. He didn't say anything, but something in his posture changed, a slight straightening, like a man who had just been handed a responsibility he intended to take seriously. Joey was already at the Shovelhead. He had arrived early, too earlier than usual, and he was doing something that 3 days ago would have been unthinkable. He was working on the engine by feel without a single diagnostic instrument in his hand. He had the cam side open, and he was running his fingers along the gear teeth of the replacement cam set that had arrived from Arizona the previous afternoon, checking the mesh, checking the contact pattern, doing it the way Walter had shown him the day before, slowly, deliberately, with attention. He didn't look up when Marcus came over. Feels right, Joey said. The mesh, I can feel where it's centered. Yeah, he paused. I couldn't have told you 2 days ago what centered mesh felt like. I would have just told you the spec number and assumed that was the same thing. It's not the same thing. No, it's really not. Joey sat back on his heels. Why didn't anybody teach me this in school? Some things can't be taught in school, Marcus said. Some things only transfer in person, hand to hand. Joey thought about that. That seems inefficient. That's because you're 26. Carl Messing's machine shop smelled like cutting oil and metal shavings, and something underneath both of those, the particular smell of precision. If precision has a smell, which Marcus had always believed it did. Carl himself was 62, built like someone who had spent 40 years standing in front of a lathe, and he shook Walter's hand with the specific warmth of people who share a rare craft and recognize each other across decades without needing to explain it. Walter Boyd, Carl said. Last time I saw you, you had hair. Last time I saw you, you had less of a gut, Walter said. Carl laughed. It was a good laugh, the laugh of a man who has heard the truth from a friend and found it funny rather than threatening. What are we making? Walter laid the destroyed drive gear on Carl's workbench and put his notepad beside it. Carl looked at the gear, looked at the specs, looked at Walter. 1977 Shovelhead oil pump drive, Carl said. Yeah, these don't exist anymore. They do now. Walter tapped the notepad. These are the tolerances. The material needs to be 4140 chromoly, not 1018, not 4130, 4140. The case hardness needs to hit 58 on the Rockwell C scale minimum. If Carl Jr. still has that induction hardening setup, he does, then we can do it right. Walter looked at Terrence. You're going to watch every cut. Ask questions when you have them. Don't let anything go past you that you don't understand. Terrence nodded. He had a small notepad of his own. He had brought it without being told. Carl mounted the stock on the lathe, and Walter stood beside him, not directing, not interfering, but close enough to see every adjustment, every measurement, every decision Carl made about feed rate and depth of cut. He narrated quietly to Terrence as it happened, the way a surgeon might narrate to a resident, not performing for the audience, but teaching in real time, because the moment was the only classroom that mattered. See how he's leaving material, Walter said. He's cutting to within 5/1000ths of final spec, not to spec, because the hardening process is going to move the material. If you cut to final spec before hardening, after hardening, you're undersize. Undersize in a gear mesh means backlash. Backlash means noise and wear and eventually failure. Terrence was writing. So you build in the hardening shrinkage. You anticipate it. Every material moves differently. 4140 moves predictably if you know its history. Carl knows this steel. He's been ordering from the same supplier for 15 years. He knows exactly how much it's going to move. How do you know that about the supplier? Walter looked at him sideways. Because I asked him. 10 minutes ago before the lathe started. That's part of the job. You don't just read the material spec. You know the material. Terrence underlined something in his notepad. The gear took 2 hours to rough. It would take another session after hardening to finish grind to final spec. Walter had planned for this, had already told Marcus the timeline, had already built it into the 4 remaining days. He ran nothing on assumption. Every step had a backup plan, and the backup plan had its own backup. On the drive back to the shop, Terrence was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He knows things that aren't written down anywhere." Walter, all of it, the material behavior, the hardening allowance, the way he looked at that original gear and knew the failure mode from the fracture pattern. None of that's in a book. "Some of it is," Walter said from the passenger seat, "but the books don't tell you what order to think about it in. That's the part that takes years." "How many years?" Walter looked out the window. "All of them," he said. "Every single one." Back at the shop, Joey had made progress on the cam installation and hit a wall simultaneously, which was becoming a pattern for this job progress and wall arriving together like they were packaged that way. The wall this time was the primary chain. The replacement chain had arrived with the cam gear set from Arizona, and when Joey went to fit it, the tension was wrong. Not the chain was correct. The tensioner mounting boss on the inner primary had worn enough that the tensioner couldn't achieve proper preload. It was the kind of problem that didn't exist as a discrete failure. It was where accumulated over 200,000 miles of operation, distributed across a dozen components, finally manifesting in a single measurement that was off by just enough to matter. Walter looked at it for 30 seconds. "We're going to make a shim," he said. "A shim," Joey repeated. "A precision shim, calculated thickness, correct material, properly seated." He went to the toolbox. "This is actually good news." "How is this good news?" "Because it's solvable." Walter looked at Joey. "You've been treating every problem on this bike like it's a disaster." "Stop doing that. Problems are just information. What you do with the information, that's what matters." Joey absorbed that. "Okay, what do we do with this information?" "We measure the gap. We calculate the required shim thickness. We cut it. We install it. Then we move on to the next problem." Walter handed him a set of feeler gauges. "Start measuring." While Joey measured and Walter supervised, Marcus's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Carla Cruz. He answered it walking toward the office the way he always took Carla's calls, away from the work, away from the noise, giving her his full attention, because she deserved at least that much. "Marcus." Her voice had a different quality today. Controlled in the way voices get controlled when the person speaking them is managing something very large and very frightening behind a surface of function. "Carla, what's happened?" "They're moving up the procedure. It was supposed to be next week. They moved it to Friday." A pause. "The doctor said his heart is there's a structural issue they didn't see initially. They need to go in sooner." Friday, 2 days. Marcus did the math instantly, involuntarily, the way you do when a deadline suddenly stops being abstract and starts being real. "Carla, I know you can't promise anything," she said quickly. "I know that. I'm not calling to put pressure on you. Raymond asked me to call. He wanted to know where things stood. He wanted a real answer, not a kind one." Marcus looked through the bay door. Walter on one side of the primary, Joey on the other, feeler gauge in hand, both of them focused on a shim calculation for a chain tensioner on a 49-year-old motorcycle. Terrence at the workbench reviewing his notes from the machine shop, already thinking about the aluminum welding that was coming. "Tell him we're still working," Marcus said. "Tell him Walter Boyd hasn't stopped. Tell him we're going to give this bike every hour we've got until Friday morning." A pause on the line. "Will that be enough?" He didn't answer that directly. He couldn't. "Tell him what I told you." Exactly that. When he came back into the bay, the shim calculation was done, and Joey was already cutting. Nobody asked who had called. They could read it in how Marcus moved the particular contained urgency of someone carrying a clock that just got louder. "Friday," Marcus said. Nobody needed more context than that. Walter nodded once. Terrence closed his notepad and went to the TIG welder. Joey cut the shim without looking up. The shop shifted into a different gear. Not panic was counterproductive, and everyone in that building knew it. But a different quality of focus settled in, the kind that comes when the reason for the work gets a specific face and a specific deadline and stops being theoretical. So, the engine case welding started that afternoon. Walter had spent 40 minutes teaching Terrence the preheat process using a heat gun to bring the aluminum case up to 300 degrees Fahrenheit before striking the arc, because cold aluminum and a TIG arc in direct sequence was a guaranteed recipe for cracking. The aluminum needed to be warm enough that the weld puddle didn't create a thermal shock at its edges. Terrence listened with the complete attention of a man who understood that listening incorrectly here had consequences that couldn't be undone. "Tell me back what I just told you," Walter said. Terrence did, precisely in order without notes. He had internalized it. "Good." Walter set the heat gun down. "Now the crack direction runs front to back along the seam. You're going to start at the front end of the crack and work toward the rear, not the other way. If you start at the rear and work forward, you're welding toward the highest stress concentration, and the arc is going to pull the material in a direction that opens the crack rather than closing it. Front to rear. Front to rear, 2-inch sections. Stop between sections, check temp, never let the case drop below 250 while you're welding." He stepped back. "I'll be right here." Terrence picked up the TIG torch. His hands were steady. Marcus noticed that specifically had been watching for it honestly, because steady hands on an unfamiliar precision job were not a given, and a shaking hand on aluminum TIG welding was not something Walter's presence could fully compensate for. Steady hands, arc struck, clean. First 2-inch section, front end of the crack. The weld puddle formed correctly. Terrence moved at the right speed, slow enough to ensure fusion fast enough to avoid excess heat input. He stopped at the 2-inch mark, checked temp with the infrared gun, 268, good. "How does it look?" he asked without taking his eyes off the case. Walter leaned in, looked at the bead, looked at the heat-affected zone around it, looked at how the material had moved. "Clean," Walter said. And there was something in that word, not just assessment, but something that might have been pride, or the closest thing to pride that Walter Boyd allowed himself in professional contexts. Second section. Third. Terrence built the weld in increments, checking temperature between each one, maintaining the heat differential that kept the aluminum cooperative rather than brittle. It took 45 minutes to complete a crack that was less than 2 inches long. 45 minutes of sustained concentration from a man who had never done this exact thing before, guided by a man who had done versions of it for 40 years. When the final arc went out, Terrence set the torch down and sat back and breathed. "Don't let it cool too fast," Walter said immediately. "Wrap it." Terrence reached for the thermal wrap without being told twice and covered the case. They would leave it wrapped for 3 hours. After that, Walter would grind the weld flush and inspect the bond. If it had fused correctly through the full depth of the crack, the case was saved. If it hadn't, if there was a void in the fusion, they would know it when they pressure tested the oil passages. And they would have to tell Raymond Cruz that the case was beyond recovery. "What do we do for 3 hours?" Joey asked. "Work on something else," Walter said. "There's always something else." He was right. The carburetor, now fully cleaned and rebuilt, needed to be calibrated: the needle position, the jet needle clip, the float height. All of it dialed to the specific requirements of this engine's state. Rebuilt, yes, but rebuilt from components that had been stressed and worn for 200,000 miles. A fresh carburetor calibration on a new engine was one thing. Calibration for a machine with this much history was a different calculation. Walter walked Joey through it, and the way he walked him through it was unlike anything in any service manual. He talked about the engine as a system with a personality, the way it would behave cold-warm under load at idle. He talked about how the float height affected everything downstream. He talked about why the factory specification was a starting point and not an answer. "The factory spec is for a new engine at sea level at 68 degrees, Walter said. "This engine is not new. It's not at sea level, we're at 1,400 feet here. And Raymond Cruz is going to want to ride this thing eventually at temperature ranges we can't predict. So we're not setting it to factory spec. We're setting it to thinking spec." "Thinking spec," Joey repeated. "The spec you arrive at by thinking about what the machine is going to actually experience, not what the book assumes." Joey was writing this down. He had started carrying a notepad too. Marcus noticed that without commenting on it, but he felt something about it that was hard to name, something between satisfaction and grief, because the knowledge being transferred in that shop over those days was real and rare, and would not exist if Walter Boyd had not answered the phone. 3 hours later, Walter unwrapped the engine case. He examined the weld under a magnifying glass, ran his fingernail along the bead, looked at the heat-affected zone for any sign of secondary cracking, pressed his thumb against the case beside the weld, and felt for any flex, any indication of incomplete fusion. The shop was silent. Joey had stopped working. Terrence was standing with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not in his pockets, just at his sides, like a person standing at attention without knowing they were doing it. Walter looked up. "It's good," he said. Terrence exhaled so hard it was almost a sound. "It's better than good," Walter said and looked at Terrence directly. "You've got a feel for aluminum. You didn't know that before today. Now you do." He set the magnifying glass down. "Remember that. That's yours now. Nobody can take it." Terrence looked at the case for a moment. Then he looked at Walter. "Thank you," he said. It came out plainly without ceremony, which was the only way it could have meant as much as it did. Walter picked up his cane. "Don't thank me. Pressure test it. Then we'll know if it actually worked." The pressure test held. 40 pounds per square inch through the oil passages held for 10 minutes. Not a single drop of oil appeared at the weld. The case was sealed. The crack that had bridged itself with old dust sludge and waited 15 years for someone to notice was now sealed with a weld that Walter Boyd had taught a 44-year-old mechanic to lay down in a shop in a city neither of them had expected to be doing this kind of work in. Marcus called Carla at 7 that evening. He kept it brief. The case was repaired. The carburetor was rebuilt and calibrated. The cam gears were installed. The drive gear was being finished ground at Carl Messing's shop and would be ready tomorrow morning. The rocker bolts were extracted and the heads were retapped and ready for reassembly. "So it's coming together?" Carla asked. "It's coming together," Marcus said. "We're not done, but we're not losing." "Raymond." She stopped, started again. "He had a harder day today. They adjusted his medication. He's been in and out." A pause. Cause? He asked about the bike again before he went under. He asked if anyone had heard it yet. "Not yet," Marcus said. "But we're close, Carla." He said, her voice caught, just once briefly, and then she had it back. He said he could still hear it in his memory. He said he remembered exactly what it sounded like when it was running right. He said it had a sound like nothing else on earth. Marcus stood in the parking lot for a long time after he hung up in the dark. With the sounds of the shop behind him, the clatter of tools being cleaned and organized for the next day, Walter's voice saying something low to Terrence about the oil pump installation sequence that was coming. He thought about a man who had ridden 200,000 miles on one machine and whose last coherent wish was to hear a sound he carried in his memory like a piece of himself. He went back inside. There was still work to do, and Thursday was already running out. Thursday arrived without ceremony and without mercy. Marcus was in the shop at 5:15. Not because he had planned to be, he had barely slept, and lying in bed at 4:30 staring at the ceiling had started to feel like a kind of cowardice. So he got up, drove in, made coffee, and stood in the back bay looking at the shovel head, in the particular silence that exists before a building fills with people and purpose. The bike was beginning to look like itself again. Not finished, not close to finished, but the random excavation of the past 4 days had given way to something that had a shape. The engine case was welded and pressure tested and clean. The cam gears were in. The carburetor sat on the bench, rebuilt, calibrated, waiting to go back on. The rocker boxes were retapped and ready. The oil pump drive gear was at Carl Messing's shop being finished ground, due back by 8 in the morning. What remained was a day's work if everything went right. Maybe more if it didn't. Marcus put his hand on the engine case, just rested it there for a moment, the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone who is struggling not to fix anything, just to make contact. The aluminum was cold, shop temperature at 5 in the morning in late October, but he held it there anyway. Walter arrived at 6, no surprise. His truck in the lot, his coffee in his hand, his toolbox already open before Marcus finished his second cup. He looked at the bike, did his morning assessment, the same quiet visual inventory he did every morning, checking that everything they had set up the night before was exactly as they had left it, and then he said without preamble, "Carl will have the gear by 8. I'm going to a shop to pick it up myself and inspect it before we install it. I don't trust shipping for this, not today." "I'll drive you," Marcus said. "I can drive myself." "I know you can. I'll drive you anyway." Walter looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine." Terrence came in at 6:30, Joey at 6:45, both earlier than usual, both with the contained energy of people who understood that today was a different category of day. Nobody said it out loud. They didn't need to. The surgery was tomorrow. The clock had a face now. Joey started on the primary reassembly while Marcus and Walter were at Carl's shop. He had been over the sequence 3 times in his notepad the night before, and again on his phone in the parking lot before he came inside. Not because he didn't know it, he did now, but because this was not a job where knowing something in the abstract was the same as being certain enough to act. He laid the parts out in installation order on a clean shop cloth. Primary chain tensioner with the shim, Walter had supervised him in cutting inner primary gasket, outer primary cover. He checked the shim thickness one more time with a micrometer point 0.024 inches, exactly what the calculation had specified. He put it down and picked up the chain and began the installation. Terrence was doing the final preparation on the oil pump cavity, cleaning the mating surfaces, checking the threaded oil passage fittings, making sure nothing had been disturbed since the pressure test. He worked steadily without rushing, which required effort this morning, because rushing was the emotional reflex when a deadline was 6 hours closer than it had been the night before. At 7:15, Joey's phone buzzed. He glanced at it out of habit and then looked longer. A text from an unknown number, but the message identified the sender. "This is Raymond Cruz. Carla is letting me use her phone. I wanted to say whatever happens today, you tell those boys thank you from me. Tell them a man they never met asked them to do something most people would have walked away from. Tell them I know that." Joey read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the workbench screen up and went back to the primary installation. He didn't call Terrence over, didn't read it out loud. He just worked, but his jaw was set in a way it hadn't been before, and his hands were completely steady. Terrence noticed the phone on the bench, noticed the expression on Joey's face, and didn't ask. He just went back to his own work. Some things communicated themselves without words in a shop where people were paying attention. Marcus and Walter returned from Carl Messing's at 8:10. Walter was carrying the finished drive gear in a clean rag, the way you carry something irreplaceable. He brought it directly to the workbench and unwrapped it under the shop light and looked at it for a full minute. It was a perfect piece of work. Carl's machining was exact, the tooth profile matching the factory spec within a single thousandth, the bore size for the correct interference fit on the shaft. Walter ran his fingernail across the tooth faces and felt the surface finish smooth, no chatter marks, no tool lines. The induction hardening had gone to 60 on the Rockwell C scale, 2 points above the minimum he had specified. "Good," Walter said. One word. But the way he said it, the exhale behind it carried everything he didn't say. He showed it to Terrence. Terrence turned it in his hands and felt what Walter had felt. "This is right," he said. "Yes, Carl does good work. Carl always did good work. That's why I've been sending people to him for 30 years. Walter took the gear back. "Okay, oil pump goes in this morning. That's the critical installation. Everything we've done up to now means nothing if the pump isn't right. After the pump, we reinstall the carburetor. After the carb primary cover. After that," he paused. "After that, we have a decision to make." "The frame crack," Marcus said. "The frame crack." They all knew it was coming. The hairline fracture in the lower frame rail had been the background problem acknowledged from day one, never fully addressed because the engine failures were more immediate. But an engine that ran perfectly inside a frame that failed under load was not a working motorcycle. It was a bomb. "What are the options?" Terrence asked. "Two," Walter said. "We TIG weld the frame rail, or we brace it, fabricate a gusset plate, weld it over the crack, distribute the stress load across a wider area." He set the gear down. "The TIG weld is cleaner. The gusset is stronger, but Raymond said do not modify." "A gusset is a modification," Joey said. "Yes. And a weld on a frame rail, is that modifying?" Walter considered. "A weld on a frame rail that's already cracked is restoring. Putting back what was there. A gusset is adding what was never there." "So we weld," Marcus said. "If we weld, we need it be right. The rail is a structural load path. Everything the engine puts out, every bump in the road, every cornering force, it all travels through that rail. A weld in the wrong location with the wrong technique creates a stress riser. A stress riser in a load path on a motorcycle frame." Walter stopped. "Raymond wants to hear it run, but somebody might also want to ride it someday. Maybe him. Maybe whoever inherits it. And if whoever inherits it rides it on a frame that fails because we welded it wrong, then we're responsible," Marcus said. "Then we're responsible," Walter agreed. The word sat in the shop like a physical thing. Responsibility. Not the professional kind, not the liability kind, the human kind. The kind that comes from understanding exactly what your work means to the people who depend on it. "You can do it right," Terrence said to Walter. It wasn't a question. I can do it right. Walter picked up the oil pump drive gear again. But it's going to add 2 hours we may not have. So we need to start the pump installation now, right now. And we need to not make any mistakes today that cost us time we can't afford to lose. Then let's go, Marcus said. The oil pump installation was the most technically demanding single task of the entire job, and everyone in the shop understood that going in. The new drive gear had to be pressed onto the pump shaft with exactly the right interference fit too loose, and it would spin on the shaft under load, destroying itself and scattering metal debris through the engine again. Too tight and the pressing process would damage the shaft or the gear bore, making the whole fabrication effort worthless. Walter set up the shop press and showed Joey how to calculate the pressing force based on the interference fit and the material properties. The number I want is between 800 and 1,100 pounds of force, he said. Below 800 and we don't have enough grip. Above 1,100 and we're distorting the bore. How do you know the force limit? Material science, 4140 chromoly at this bore diameter and this interference is the elastic limit of the material tells you. It's in the numbers if you know how to read them. And if I don't know how to read them yet, then you watch me read them and you remember what you see. Walter positioned the gear on the press plate. Watch the gauge. Call out the number when it starts moving. Joey watched the gauge. The press handle moved. The needle climbed. 850, Joey said. Hold. 910. Hold. The gear seated. Full contact. The gauge read 940. Done, Walter said. He pulled the assembly out of the press and inspected the gear seating with the loop. Perfect. Joey looked at the gauge reading 940, and at the window Walter had specified 800 to 1,100 and did the math on how much margin there was on either side. What if I'd been running the press, he asked. Then I would have been watching the gauge, Walter said. That's why there are two of us. It took 1 hour and 20 minutes to install the pump torque, the mounting hardware, and connect the oil passages. Walter checked every fitting twice. He ran his finger around every connection point and felt for any irregularity. He torqued each bolt to spec and marked the bolt heads with a paint pen, a technique for visually confirming that nothing had backed off, that nothing had moved from where it was meant to be. Paint pen, Joey said. I've seen that in aviation maintenance. Aviation borrowed it from engine building, Walter said. Or engine building borrowed it from aviation. At this point, nobody remembers who thought of it first. What matters is that it works. It was 11:30 when Marcus's phone rang again. He looked at the screen and felt his stomach drop. Carla. He answered it. They moved the procedure up again, she said. She wasn't controlling her voice the same way she had been. Something had given way in the effort of controlling it, not collapsed, but loosened. They want to do it this afternoon. 2 o'clock. Carla. I know, Marcus. I'm not asking you to. I don't even know why I'm calling. She stopped. He's asking. He keeps asking. Marcus looked at the clock on the wall. 11:30. 2 o'clock was 2.5 hours. He walked to the back bay. Carburetor was not yet installed. It was on the bench ready, maybe 15 minutes of work. Primary cover was ready another 20 minutes. Frame rail weld. Walter had estimated 2 hours minimum. Oil and fuel fill initial priming starting sequence. 2 hours minimum after that for the frame, plus the assembly, work 3 hours total if nothing went wrong. 2.5 hours. He stood in the doorway of the back bay and looked at Walter, who was setting up the carburetor installation and had not heard the phone call. Terrence was at the bench prepping the frame welding materials. Joey was checking the primary cover gasket seating. Walter, Marcus said. Walter turned. 2 o'clock, Marcus said. Just that, 2 words. Walter looked at the clock, looked at the bike, looked at Marcus. He understood immediately not just the logistics, but the weight of it. Everything the 2 words meant. He was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said, carburetor first, Terrence primary cover while I do the carb. We're running parallel now. Joey, start on the frame assessment. I need measurements on that crack before I can weld it. In parallel, Terrence asked. The primary cover needs. I know what it needs. You know what it needs. Do it. Walter was already moving toward the carburetor with a focus that had shifted into another register. Still precise, still controlled, but with an urgency underneath it that had not been there before. Not panic, something more like grief converted into action. We're not missing this. We're not. Joey had the frame crack measurements done in 8 minutes. He handed the notepad to Walter, who looked at the numbers while simultaneously directing Terrence on the primary gasket positioning. The ability to process two streams of information simultaneously was not something Walter had ever practiced. It was simply what 40 years of high-stakes mechanical work produced in a person. Triage, prioritization, the ability to hold the whole system in your head and work on parts of it in the right order without losing track of the whole. The crack is 13 millimeters, Joey said. Depth I estimated at 3 to 4 millimeters, Walter said, based on the visual and the pressure behavior from the case test. That's consistent. He handed the notepad back. We're not doing the gusset, no time. We're welding it single pass, preheated, same technique as the case. Terrence, you're doing it again. Terrence looked up from the primary cover. Again. You did it right the first time. Do it right the second time. Walter looked at him steadily. There isn't anyone else. Terrence held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the primary cover and tightened the final cover bolt. Give me 3 minutes. The carburetor went on at 12:10. Walter torqued the mounting nuts in a cross pattern, connected the fuel line, set the throttle cable tension by feel, no spec, no measuring tool. Just the movement of the slide under his thumb and 40 years of knowing what correct tension felt like. He connected the choke cable and left it set at half choke for the initial start, which was a calculation based on how long the engine had been dormant, what the carburetor calibration would do at cold start, and what the air temperature was doing to the fuel-air mixture in late October at 1,400 feet above sea level. Joey watched all of this. He was not helping. He was witnessing. He understood the difference. The frame welding started at 12:25. Terrence preheated the frame rail with the heat gun 300 degrees, checked with the infrared gun, same protocol as the case, and Walter stood behind him and slightly to the left where he could see the weld puddle without being in Terrence's way. Front to rear, Terrence said to himself. Front to rear, Walter confirmed. Walter. The arc struck. The puddle formed. Terrence moved at the same pace he had moved on the case, learned pace, not natural pace, the pace that Walter had taught him over 2 days of watching and absorbing and asking the right questions. Joey watched the clock. 12:28, 12:30, 12:35. First section done. Temp check 272. Second section. Third. The crack was longer than the case crack, had been 13 millimeters of frame rail, which translated to 5 sections at Walter's 2-inch increment protocol. At 12:52, Terrence set the torch down. Walter leaned in with the loop before Terrence had even moved away from the bike. He looked at each section of weld in sequence. He pressed. He felt. He looked at the heat-affected zones. It's good, he said. Joey checked the clock. 12:53. 1 hour and 7 minutes until 2 o'clock. We need oil, Marcus said. We need fuel. We need to prime the pump before we attempt to start. I know, Walter said. He was already moving. Fresh oil 2050 weight, not synthetic. Synthetic on a rebuilt shovel head, running in for the first time. I have it, Marcus said. He had bought it 2 days ago on Walter's instructions and had it waiting on the shelf. He brought the quart over and Walter took it and began filling the oil tank with the particular care of someone who understood that the oil going in right now was the first oil these rebuilt components would ever see. It mattered what it was and how it went in. Fuel, Marcus filled the tank not full, just enough. A gallon, enough to run without risk of a fuel system problem from a too heavy load on the petcock. Petcock, Walter said. Joey had already positioned himself at the petcock and turned it to prime. Done. Throttle 1/8, Marcus said, hand on the grip. Choke half. Walter looked at the bike, looked at the entire assembled machine. Did his final visual inventory, the last complete pass over everything, looking for anything out of place, anything that had been missed, anything that didn't belong. His eyes stopped on the primary cover. He crouched down, looked at the bottom of the primary, put his finger against the drain plug, the replacement drain plug they had installed after discovering the cracked original. It was finger tight, not torqued. Terrence had installed it during the parallel work at 12:10, and in the controlled urgency of everything happening simultaneously, the final torque step had not happened. Terrence, Walter said. The tone of his voice brought everyone still. The primary drain plug. Terrence was across the bay in 3 steps. He looked at the plug. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in rapid succession. Recognition, horror, relief that it had been caught. He grabbed the correct wrench, got on his knee, and torqued it properly. 8 foot-pounds. Checked it. 8 foot-pounds. Done, he said. Say it out loud, Walter said. Don't just know it. Say it. Primary drain plug, torqued to spec. Confirmed. Good. Walter straightened. That's how you catch the thing that kills you. You go slow when your instinct says go fast. You check what you already think you checked. He looked at all 3 of them. That plug loose on a running engine 10 seconds, and we lose all our primary oil. Primary runs dry chain, fails, everything we did falls apart on the floor. He paused. We caught it. That's what matters. But we caught it because somebody was still looking. 1:15 on the clock. Okay, Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but it carried everything. Let's try to start her. Walter moved to the left side of the bike. Joey took a position near the throttle at Marcus's direction. Terrence stood back, not out of disinterest, but out of understanding that this moment belonged to Marcus. Marcus had been the one who took the job. Marcus had made the call to Walter. Marcus had carried the weight of Raymond Cruz's note for 9 days. Marcus put his hand on the kickstarter. It had not been kicked in 15 years. The kickstart mechanism itself had been freed and lubricated 2 days ago, one of the 100 small tasks that had been done without fanfare. But freeing it in static testing was not the same as putting weight on it against a compression stroke. He found the compression, pushed through it, felt the resistance, real resistance, the resistance of a healthy engine with proper compression, not the slack looseness of a blown engine. That resistance alone was information. Good information. He kicked. The engine turned over but didn't fire. Choke richer, Walter said immediately. Full choke. Joey moved the choke to full. Marcus kicked again. A cough, not a start, a cough, a single combustion event that didn't sustain but a combustion event nonetheless. The engine had fuel and spark and compression in the same place at the same time. Again, Walter said, don't rush it. Same pace. 1:47 on the clock. Marcus kicked a third time. The engine caught. For 1 second, 2 seconds, a rough, lumpy idle that sounded like something waking up from a very long sleep, uneven and uncertain and beautiful. Then it fell off. Died. It's trying, Joey said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. Idle screw, Walter said. Half turn in. Marcus reached for the idle adjustment on the carburetor and turned it half a revolution clockwise. His hand was completely steady. He did not think about the time. He did not think about Raymond Cruz in a hospital bed. He did not think about anything except the half turn he was making and why he was making it. He kicked again. The engine caught, held, stumbled, held again. The idle was rough, lumpy, uneven, the sound of a machine that had not yet found its rhythm, but it was there. It was running. The shovelhead was alive. For 11 seconds, Iron and Grit Custom Repair was filled with the sound of a 1977 engine running for the first time in 15 years. Then Walter held up his hand. Kill it, he said. Marcus cut the engine. Silence. What? Joey said. The word came out sharp, almost angry. Walter, it was running. I know. Walter was already crouching beside the engine, his head tilted, listening to something in the silence that the engine had left behind. I heard something. It was running rough. Not the rough idle. Something else, Vietnam. He put his hand on the engine case, moved it. There, do you feel that? Marcus put his hand on the case beside Walter's, felt it. A vibration that wasn't the vibration of running a specific rhythmic resonance in the metal coming from a location that was not the engine. Frame, Marcus said. Frame, Walter confirmed. He stood, moved to the lower frame rail, ran his hand along it, stopped at a point 3 inches from the weld Terrence had laid down 40 minutes ago. He pressed. The frame moved, fractionally, but it moved. There's a secondary fracture, Walter said. Adjacent to the weld beam. The heat from the weld relieved the stress at the original crack and transferred it to the next weak point in the rail. He pressed again. The frame is not safe to ride. The shop went quiet with a completeness that was different from every other silence of the past 9 days. But it ran, Joey said. He wasn't arguing. He was processing. It ran, Walter agreed. So Raymond, if we recorded it, if we played it for him, we don't know if that's enough, Marcus said. We don't know if it isn't, Joey said back. They stood in that space for a moment, the space between what they had accomplished and what it was worth, which were two different measurements, and both of them mattered. The clock read 1:51, 9 minutes to 2 o'clock. Walter looked at the frame, looked at the bike, looked at Marcus. "The engine is right," Walter said. "I want you to understand that. Everything we did, the pump, the carburetor, the case, the cam gears, all of it is right. This engine will run. It will run well. It needs more time, and it needs the frame rebuilt correctly, not rushed." He paused. "But the sound you heard those 11 seconds, that was real. That was this engine. That was what Raymond heard for 200,000 miles." Marcus looked at his phone. He had recorded it. He hadn't decided to. His hand had moved to his pocket and started the recording at the second kick, operating on an instinct below conscious thought. 11 seconds of a 1977 Shovelhead running for the first time in 15 years. He looked at Walter. Walter looked back at him. "Call her," Walter said. Marcus dialed Carla's number, standing right there beside the bike, not moving to the office, not stepping outside. Whatever happened next was going to happen in this shop in front of these people, because everything that had been built over 9 days belonged to all of them. It rang twice. "Marcus." Her voice was already different, tighter, compressed, the voice of someone sitting in a hospital waiting area with a procedure scheduled in minutes. "Carla, is Raymond still conscious? Can he hear?" A pause. Movement sounds, her shoes on a hard floor. Yes, he's awake. They're prepping him. They said we have a few minutes before Marcus. What's happening?" "Put the phone near his ear," Marcus said. "Right now. Don't ask me anything else yet. Just put it near his ear." Another pause, longer. Marcus heard hospital ambient sound, the soft mechanical breathing of a place where people were being kept alive by effort and technology. Then Carla's voice away from the phone. Raymond, it's Marcus Webb. He needs you to listen." Marcus held his phone toward the Shovelhead. He opened the recording. He pressed play. 11 seconds. The sound that came out of that phone speaker was rough and uneven and imperfect and absolutely completely olive, the bark of a shovelhead coming back from 15 years of silence, lumpy at idle, unsteady, not yet sure of itself, but running. Running with compression and fuel and spark, all arriving in the right place at the right time inside an engine that 4 mechanics had spent 9 days pulling back from the edge of permanent death. Marcus watched the seconds count on his screen. 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The recording ended, silence on the line. Then a sound from the phone that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not words, not quite. Something that started as a breath and became something else. Raymond Cruz, 61 years old, tubes in his arm, a cardiac procedure 9 minutes away, hearing the machine that had carried him 200,000 miles through 30 years of living speak its name one more time. Carla came back on the line. Her voice had broken completely, and she wasn't trying to hide it anymore. He's nodding. He can't talk right now, but she stopped. "He's smiling, Marcus. He's actually smiling." Marcus put his hand over his eyes, not to hide, just to have somewhere to put the feeling. Behind him, nobody in the shop said a word. Joey had turned away and was looking at the far wall with the focused attention of someone who had found a fixed point and was holding on to it. Terrence was sitting on a stool with his forearms on his knees, head down, not moving. Walter Boyd was standing very still with his hand on the engine case of the Shovelhead, the same position Marcus had been in at 5:15 that morning. Hand on cold aluminum, just making contact. "Tell him," Marcus started, stopped, started again. "Tell him the engine is right. Tell him we're not done with the bike. We're going to finish the frame and do this correctly, and when it's ready, whenever that is, it's going to be everything it should be." He paused. "Tell him Walter Boyd says she's got plenty of miles left." A sound from the phone, Carla relaying the message. Then a different sound, Raymond's voice faint but present, saying something Marcus couldn't fully hear. He heard 2 words clearly, maybe 3. "What did he say?" Marcus asked. Carla was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was completely undone and completely steady, at the same time the way voices get when emotion and will are both operating at maximum. He said, "Tell Walter he still owes him a beer from 1989. Walter heard that. He was close enough to hear it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. There was no collapse, no visible breaking. But something in his face moved some deep internal structure that he had been holding in place for 9 days shifted by a fraction, and he turned his head away from the bike for just a moment and looked at the ceiling, and then he looked back down and his hand was still on the engine case. "Tell him I remember," Walter said quietly, "and I'm collecting." Carla called again at 4:30. The procedure had gone well, better than projected. The structural issue the doctors had been concerned about had been addressable in a way that preliminary imaging hadn't fully conveyed something about the approach, about what they found when they were actually inside being less catastrophic than the worst-case scenario they had been preparing for. Raymond was in recovery. He was stable. The doctor had used the word encouraging, which in hospital language was as close to good news as careful people allowed themselves to get. Marcus relayed this to the shop, and the reaction was nothing dramatic. Just a visible loosening in 3 men who had been holding tension in their bodies for 9 days and were only now beginning to understand how much tension that had been. Joey sat down on a shop stool and rubbed his face with both hands. Terrence closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them and went back to what he had been doing, which was beginning the assessment of the secondary frame fracture. Walter nodded once, said, "Good," and picked up his coffee. "We're not done," Walter said. "Not as a reminder, as an orientation, something to anchor them now that the immediate emergency had passed and the next phase needed to begin." "The frame," Terrence said, looking up from his assessment notes. "The frame. And I want to pull the valve covers and check the rocker geometry now that the engine has actually run. 11 seconds under load, even 11 seconds to tells you things that static assembly can't tell you. I want to see if everything's seated correctly." "What are we looking for?" Joey asked. "Anything that moved when it shouldn't have. Any geometry change in the rocker arm sweep. Any evidence that the rebuilt components responded differently under actual combustion load than they did on the bench." Walter set his coffee down. "An engine that runs in theory and an engine that runs in reality, but they are 2 different engines until they've proven themselves the same thing." Joey stood up. "Okay, what do I do?" "You take notes," Walter said. "Everything I find, everything I measure, everything I decide, you write it down. Not because I'll forget, because you need to have it." "For what?" Walter looked at him. "For the next time, for the time after that, for the time 30 years from now, when some young mechanic asks you how you know what you know, and you reach into your experience and pull out this job." He paused. "You write it down because knowledge that isn't passed on dies with the person carrying it, and there's been enough of that already." Joey got his notepad. The rocker inspection took 2 hours and revealed something none of them had fully anticipated. Not a problem, but a confirmation that functioned almost like a verdict. The rocker geometry was perfect. The rebuilt components had seated under load exactly as Walter had predicted they would. The contact patterns matching his expectations, within tolerances that spoke to the precision of everything that had preceded this moment. The cam timing was true. The valve lift was symmetric. The engine had not just started, it had started correctly with the internal architecture, behaving the way a well-built engine behaved. When Walter finished the inspection and stood up, there was a quality to his silence that was different from all the other silences he had produced in that shop. Not reluctance, not concern. Something that took Marcus a moment to identify. Satisfaction. "This engine is right," Walter said, for the second time. But this time without the qualifier, about the frame, without the asterisk. Just the statement standing alone. "You sound surprised," Terrence said. "Not surprised." Walter picked up his cane from where he had propped it against the workbench. "Relieved. There's a difference." He looked at the bike. "I wasn't sure what 15 years of neglect had done to the cylinder walls. I wasn't sure if the piston rings were going to seat correctly on a bore that hadn't seen oil in that long. I wasn't sure if the valve seals had degraded enough to cause problems we couldn't see until the engine was hot." He paused. "But Raymond Cruz maintained this machine for 200,000 miles before it went silent. He took care of it for decades. And that care, all those years of doing it right, that care was still in there. Preserved. Waiting." He touched the engine case. The machine remembered how it was supposed to be. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Joey said very quietly, "That's what you meant on day 1, when you said it wasn't dead. It was just been ignored too long." "Yes." "You already knew then that it was going to be okay." Walter considered that. "I knew it was possible. Possible and certain are different things. I didn't know it was going to be okay until 20 minutes ago." He looked at Joey. That's what experience gives you, not certainty, accurate possibility. You learn to tell the difference between a machine that can be saved and one that can't. And you learn to pursue the ones that can with everything you have because they deserve it. He paused. This one deserved it. The secondary frame fracture assessment, however, took Terrence the rest of that afternoon and into the evening. He was thorough in a way that would have been unrecognizable compared to the Terrence who had looked at this bike on day one, not slower but deeper. He measured the fracture propagation direction. He assessed the heat-affected zone from the earlier weld and understood why the stress had transferred the weld had been correct, but the material on either side of it had been compromised by 49 years of load cycling, and releasing the stress concentration at the original crack had simply revealed the next weakest point. He brought his findings to Walter, who reviewed them and confirmed what Terrence had already concluded. The right repair was a sleeve, a section of matching diameter steel tubing fitted inside the frame rail across the fractured zone welded at both ends, structurally continuous with the original tube. Not visible from outside, not a modification in any meaningful sense. A restoration of structural integrity to the original load path, using a technique that had been employed in frame repair since motorcycles had frames. This is the correct approach, Walter said, looking at Terrence's drawings, actual pencil drawings, on graph paper dimensions noted in Terrence's precise handwriting. I know, Terrence said. He said it without arrogance. He said it the way you say something you have verified carefully and are now willing to stand behind. You're going to do the sleeve installation. Yes. And the final weld. Yes, Terrence looked at Walter. You're not going to tell me I'm not ready. I'm going to tell you exactly what I've been telling you for 4 days, Walter said. I'll be right next to you. That's the only answer that matters. The sleeve installation began the following morning, Friday, the day after Raymond's procedure, the day that had been the original deadline and had passed in the way deadlines sometimes pass, replaced by a different and more durable timeline. Not urgency anymore. Precision. Carl Messing cut the sleeve stock to Terrence's dimensions with the accuracy that had characterized every piece of work his shop had contributed to this job. Terrence fitted it into the frame rail with a patience that was entirely his own. Not Walter's patience adopted as imitation, but something that had grown in him over the past 9 days as a genuine property of how he worked. He tacked it in place, checked the alignment, checked it again. Walter stood beside him and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Terrence knew what he was doing. The weld was clean, cleaner than the case weld, cleaner than the frame crack repair. Because this was the third weld, and the third weld always carries the learning of the first two. The heat-affected zone was controlled. The penetration was full. The bead had a consistency that Walter, looking at it through the loop, described with a single word. Professional, he said. Terrence looked at him. Is that different from good? Good is what you produce when you do something correctly. Professional is what you produce when doing it correctly has become who you are. Walter handed back the loop. There's a difference. You crossed it on this weld. The bike was fully assembled by Saturday afternoon. Everything. Every piece that had been removed, repaired, rebuilt, fabricated or replaced was back in its correct position, torqued to specification, marked with Walter's paint pen, verified by at least 2 sets of eyes. The carburetor was on. The primary was sealed. The oil was in. The frame was structurally whole for the first time since whenever the original crack had initiated years ago, maybe decades. Nobody would ever know exactly when. Marcus filled the fuel tank properly this time. A full tank. The right amount for a real start. He called Carla before they tried. Not because he needed permission, because she deserved to know. Because Raymond deserved to know through her. We're ready, he told her. The real start. Everything is done. A pause on the line. How does she look? Marcus looked at the bike. Looked at it the way he had not allowed himself to look at it during the work, not as a collection of problems and solutions, but as a whole thing. A 1977 Shovelhead Realm, 49 years old, that had carried one man through 30 years and 200,000 miles and had been brought back from 15 years of silence by 4 men who had not quit when every reasonable metric said they should. She looks right, he said. She looks exactly like herself. Carla was quiet for a moment. Raymond said to tell you, he said don't baby it. He said kick it like you mean it. Marcus laughed. An actual laugh, the first real one in 9 days. Tell him we will. They gathered around the bike the same way they had gathered 2 days before Marcus at the Kickstarter. Walter to the left, Terrence and Joey standing back, giving Marcus the space that was his. But the quality of the gathering was different now. Not the desperate urgency of a 2 o'clock deadline. Not the controlled fear of a first attempt. Something quieter, more settled. Walter did his final check, hands moving over the bike with the complete fluency of someone who had worked on this specific machine long enough that his hands knew it by feel. Petcock, throttle position, choke setting, oil lines, primary, frame. His palm against the engine case one last time. "She's ready," he said. Marcus found the compression stroke. Same as before, real resistance, healthy compression, a machine that was alive and charged and waiting. He kicked. The engine fired on the first kick. Not a cough, not a catch and die. A fire immediate full, the shovel head catching on the very first downstroke and settling into an idle that was rough for exactly 3 seconds and then smoothed as the carburetor found its calibration point and the oil pressure built and the cam gears meshed at the geometry Walter had specified, and the rebuilt pump pushed clean oil through passages that had been scored and cleaned and restored to function. The idle steadied, deepened, found its rhythm. It was loud. Shovels were always loud, not the aggressive loud of a modern performance engine, but the particular loud of an old American V-twin that had never apologized for the amount of space it occupied in the world. It had a sound that was entirely its own, a cadence, a voice, the specific mechanical signature of this engine, and no other, the sound that Raymond Cruz had said he still heard in his memory. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved for a full 30 seconds. Walter walked slowly around the bike, listening. His head was tilted at the angle it always tilted when he was reading a machine through sound. He listened to the primary. He listened to the top end. He listened to the exhaust note and what it told him about combustion completeness. He crouched and put his hand near the engine cases and felt the heat and the vibration and the pattern of both. He stood up. "Let it warm up," he said. "Don't touch the throttle. Let it find itself." They did. For 4 minutes, the shovel head sat in the center of iron and grit custom repair and ran, just ran. The idle settled further as the engine reached operating temperature, the mechanical noise tightening slightly as tolerances closed with thermal expansion. Everything moving toward the equilibrium of a properly built machine doing what it was built to do. At the 4-minute mark, Walter said, "Blip the throttle once. Easy." Marcus touched the grip, rolled it open a quarter turn and released. The engine responded instantly, no hesitation, no stumble. The carburetor delivering exactly what Walter had calibrated it to deliver, the engine pulling the RPMs up and releasing them cleanly, the idle recovering in under a second. Joey made a sound. It wasn't a word, just a sound, involuntary, the sound a person makes when something they have worked toward for 9 days reveals itself to be real. Terrence sat down on his stool. He sat down because his legs made a decision his brain hadn't fully ratified yet, and he sat there with his forearms on his knees and looked at the running motorcycle and said nothing for a long time. Walter looked at Marcus. "She's right," he said. "Everything we did, it held." "Yeah," Marcus said. His voice was steady, his eyes were not. "Yeah." He recorded 4 minutes and 20 seconds of the bike running. Not just the start, the full idle, the throttle blip, the settling, all of it. He sent it to Carla's phone with a single line of text. "This is what Raymond asked for." Her response came back in under a minute. No words, just a single photograph. Raymond Cruz in his hospital bed, phone held to his ear, eyes closed. And on his face, not a smile exactly, though there was something around his mouth that might have been one. Something more than a smile. The expression of a person receiving something they had believed in the private arithmetic of very sick people that they might not receive. The expression of someone hearing a sound they had been carrying in their memory like a promise confirmed. Marcus showed the photo to the shop, passed his phone to Terrence, who looked at it, and passed it to Joey, who looked at it for a long time and then passed it to Walter. Walter looked at the photo. He looked at it for longer than any of them had. He looked at Raymond Cruz's face, at the closed eyes, at the phone pressed against the ear of a man who had ridden 200,000 miles and was lying in a hospital bed listening to the machine that had carried him through all of them speak its name again. He handed the phone back to Marcus. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Turn it off, let her cool down properly. Full cool down before we do anything else." Marcus reached for the petcock and shut down the fuel. The engine ran on for a few seconds, the carburetor clearing itself, and then dropped and stumbled and went silent. The silence it left was not the silence from before. The silence from before had been the silence of failure of a machine that could not do the thing it was built to do. This silence was different. This was the silence after. The silence that exists when something has been completed. They cleaned the shop that evening, all four of them, which was not standard procedure, but felt right the way certain things feel right without needing to be decided. Walter swept the section of floor where he had been working, which was something Marcus had never seen him do at anyone else's shop. And the fact that he did it here without being asked said something about what these 9 days had made this place for him. Joey collected all his notes, the full notepad, every page, and photographed each one with his phone before putting the originals in his tool bag. When Terrence asked what he was doing, Joey said, "Making sure I don't lose it." He said it simply without elaboration, but Terrence understood. They all understood. Terrence rolled the shovel head back into the clean bay, not covered, not stored away, just positioned where it belonged, stable on its stand, the recently rebuilt engine visible through the cases in a way that communicated permanence rather than exposure. Walter was the last one to leave, which surprised Marcus until he thought about it, and then it didn't surprise him at all. Walter went around the bike one final time, the same inventory he had done every morning, the same hands-to-metal contact, the same tilted head, listening even though the engine was cold now, and there was nothing to listen for. He ran his hand along the frame rail where Terrence had laid the sleeve weld. He touched the carburetor. He touched the engine case, both welds pressing gently against each to verify what he already knew. Then he picked up his toolbox and his cane and walked to the door. "Walter," Marcus said. The old man stopped. "What do we owe you?" Walter looked at him. There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, not evasive, measured, like he was actually calculating something. Then he said, "Raymond Cruz still owes me a beer from 1989. I'll collect that from him when he gets out of the hospital." He paused. "You don't owe me anything. You took the job when you could have said no. You called me when you could have given up. You let Terrence and that kid learn things that most shops never teach." He looked back at the bike one more time. "That's payment enough." He left. Marcus stood in the quiet shop for a few minutes after Walter's truck pulled out of the lot. He looked at the 1977 shovel head and at 49 years of road and weight and memory, at a machine that had been given back to itself by people who refused to accept that some things were too far gone to save. He thought about Raymond Cruz hearing 11 seconds of that engine on a phone speaker in a hospital room and smiling with his eyes closed. He thought about Walter Boyd standing in a machine shop at 68 years old teaching a 44-year-old mechanic how to weld aluminum by hand because the knowledge lived in him and he had decided it was worth one more transfer. He thought about Joey carrying a notepad full of handwritten notes out of a shop where he had arrived 3 weeks ago, believing that diagnosis meant a tablet in a diagnostic port, and left understanding that diagnosis meant listening, really listening to what a machine was trying to say. He thought about Terrence, who had crossed a line that day and knew it, and would carry the crossing of it in his hands for the rest of his working life. He turned off the shop lights. The shovel head sat in the dark, silent hole and fully itself proof that some things are not too broken to come back, that patience applied with enough precision becomes a form of love, and that the knowledge of how to save something worth saving never dies, as long as there is one person left who is willing to pick up the phone and answer on the second ring. Raymond Cruz got his one more time, and the machine that had never left him stranded not once in 200,000 miles kept that record intact.